Hello everyone, and welcome to Lab Manager's Product Spotlight webinar series. I'm Tanuja Kopal, contributing editor for Lab Manager, and I will be hosting today's discussion where technical specialist and inventory consultant John Webb will discuss ways to find and fix the 8 most common chemical management errors that will ensure the availability of accurate and real-time chemical data. John leverages his application expertise as ChemSW to assist organizations around the world to optimize and streamline their chemical inventory management. And we certainly hope that today you can benefit from his knowledge and expertise as well. This webinar is meant to be very interactive. So please feel free to send me your comments or questions by typing it into the question box that appears on the right-hand side of your screen. You can submit questions anytime during the webinar, but we will address your questions right after John has given his entire talk. Today's webinar will also be available for viewing on Lab Manager's website, www.labmanager.com, for 6 months. The website also hosts a number of resources, such as technical bulletins, application notes, and white papers that you may find useful. In our closing slide, we will provide you with John's email address, so you can reach out to him for a copy of his slides or if you need further guidance on this topic. You will not be able to download any slides from our website. So with that, let me turn it over to John. Welcome to the webinar, John.
Thank you very much, Tanusha. Really appreciate it. And welcome. Thank you guys all very much for taking time out of your busy day to attend our webinar on how to find and fix the top 8 chemical management errors. So just a quick buzz through for our agenda today. Of course, as Tanusha mentioned, my name is John Webb, and I'm a senior technical representative here at ChemSW. We're going to discuss today the chemical inventory management challenges that lots and lots of organizations face around the world. We're also going to discuss the top 8 chemical management errors that I find when speaking with folks around the world. We're also going to be providing information about the goals that organizations should have when having an efficient chemical inventory system, and we're also going to discuss the best practices for managing lab chemical inventory. And as Tanusha said, this is definitely designed to be interactive, so feel free to submit the questions to Tanusha, and we're going to have a nice long period of time at the end of the discussion for questions and answers. So just jumping right in, chemical inventory and data management challenges at organizations around the world include knowing specifically what materials are actually on site, where those materials are actually located, and how materials are being stored and how much is there. So how do you really know when chemical inventory management is out of control? Well, inventory levels are unknown, MSDSs are not stored correctly and easily accessible, researchers don't have the right materials in the right place at the right time, chemical spend is excessive, and the organization is not in compliance. I have lots and lots of conversations with people around the world. I go on site for on-site tours. I talk with folks all the time, and one of the first things that people say to me is, we just don't know what we have, so we're constantly running out of things that we need, so we have to put a rush on those orders, and so we don't have delays. But I really feel like the problem goes deeper than that. That's just really the surface problem, not knowing what you have. There are much more serious risks and danger of not knowing what you have on site. Saying we kind of know what's on site is like saying I kind of failed a test. So really the deeper concern is for the safety of the personnel that will interact with or be exposed to these materials. The number 1 chemical management error is over-ordering chemical inventory. This error has significant trickle-down effects or related effects, one of them being operating costs, which can affect the organization as a whole. Mismanaged inventory leads to excess materials on hand, which leads to excess waste generation. A typical laboratory has thousands of chemical containers in inventory. In addition to chemicals and reagents, laboratories have things like supplies, gas cylinders, biomaterials, equipment, and instruments. Inventory material costs can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for research facilities. When many different people are using these materials, if the laboratory doesn't track the usage in real time and provide real-time visibility, people may think that they're out of the material and just get more on order. People will also reorder what they can't find. We know that to be true, driving up chemical procurement and waste costs. The second most common chemical management error is definitely related to the first, not being able to locate chemicals you need when you need them. Again, to my earlier point, people will just reorder what they can't find, especially if they have an open purchase card, and we see this quite a bit in universities. But consider this, why can't people find chemicals? The answer is because there is no process in place for ordering and receiving new materials. It's just left up to the people. It's total chaos. Organizations have more than one process for chemicals and chemical supplies to enter the facility. This is a huge problem because if more than one person and more than one department and more than one procedure is in place for receiving those materials, then there's not really going to be any standardization and nobody's going to know specifically what's on site. The chaos continues with the information captured. If there's no process in place and if it's just left up to the people, this leaves simple inventory tasks up to highly paid research professionals who, just based on the time that they have during the day, will only put the bare bones information in, if at all. The end result is there will not be any standardization of information about the material coming on site. This is a huge problem, especially when the materials are hazardous, very expensive, or highly regulated. This leads us to the third chemical management error, not optimizing chemical expiration dates. Organizations that do not track chemicals at the container level will have difficulty knowing when a specific container will expire. If the materials are not checked in properly and the individual containers of these materials are not being registered, then it's safe to say the expiration date of the container is not being recorded. Now, I know sometimes the manufacturer's suggested expiration date is listed on the bottle, but that means you actually have to be looking at the bottle. And if what I know to be true remains true, by the time you find that bottle, it's likely to already be expired. Expired containers become a financial burden and a liability risk. I repeat, expired containers become a financial burden and a liability risk. Wouldn't it be great if you could actually forecast the expiration dates of containers? That way you can use the containers that will expire earliest first. I was on site just recently with an organization that was being led around by a senior lab manager, and we were talking about what drove her most crazy when it came to laboratory chemical inventory. And she said having to send unopened containers or chemicals that hadn't even been used to chemical waste. She said, what a waste. She said, by the time we find this stuff, it's no good. Coupled with not knowing expiration dates, we see the next common chemical inventory error, having inaccurate data about chemicals on site. Inaccurate data about chemicals on site, specifically when it comes to records, causes inventory to not be updated. The data that is collected is almost always incomplete, and lab personnel spend valuable research hours doing inventory. I was at another organization about 6 months ago and was on a tour with the facility by the EHS director, and I asked him a question about how he was able to know what he had on site and how each lab reported their specific inventory. He walked over to a folder that was placed on the outside of the laboratory and said, "This is the laboratory is supposed to update these sheets once a year so we know what's in the lab." And he said, since it's so time-consuming for the researchers to actually audit their inventory, we only require them to do it once per year. But he said the drawback there is that the spreadsheets are not accurate even when we get them, and we have no visibility for what's in there the rest of the year. And when it comes time for me to produce site inventory reports, it's really just a guess. And so I'm always hoping and praying that the Department of Homeland Security doesn't stop by for a site audit. Inaccurate data specifically about MSDSs. We all know that MSDSs should be product specific. We all know that employees should have quick and easy access, and that the material safety data sheets should be updated regularly. Inaccurate data about chemicals on site leads to problems with this, with having the right MSDS or SDS on hand for the specific products you have on site. First and foremost, you need to have a one-to-one match for materials owned to MSDS. Further, the MSDS needs to be product specific. Lastly, the MSDS needs to be easily accessible to all personnel. Believe it or not, most organizations are still trying to manage their MSDS in binders. Paper MSDS stored in binders. In this day and age, no electronic storage. I was at a university a while back and on another tour, and we happened to be walking through a basement corridor on our way to the next lab when something caught my eye. It was rows and rows of old style cabinets with MSDS labeled on the outside of them. I asked the facilities director who was with us, how do people on campus that don't have access to this floor gain access to an MSDS? I guess they don't, he said. So needless to say, this university was definitely out of compliance with OSHA's right to know. The next big chemical management error is attempting to track chemicals manually with spreadsheets. Spreadsheets lead to inaccurate data. We all know this. For the example that I used earlier about labs hanging their chemical inventory spreadsheets outside of the laboratory door is a practice I see far too often. This is a weak attempt at warning people before they go into the lab about the specific hazards they may be exposed to. But the risk goes further than that. It really boils down to the risk of liability. We already know that researchers don't have time to update spreadsheets, and they really don't want to. What if someone ordered a potentially harmful material and it ended up on a shelf somewhere in the lab and is now forgotten about? What if there are certain threshold limits for certain materials in certain zones of a building? If the spreadsheets are only updated every so often, if at all, how will anyone ever know if the limits are exceeding the fire code? And if there's an emergency, how would you ever be able to tell first responders what is truly in that building or in that lab? I was speaking with a colleague of mine the other day, and he told me a story about a research facility in the Northeast that had burned to the ground. The fire started in a lab and quickly spread. When the fire department arrived on site, they asked for a detailed report of what was specifically in that building. Since the organization could not produce any real-time information about the materials in that building, they let the building burn to the ground, costing the organization millions of dollars, completely unnecessarily. Using spreadsheets to manage chemical inventory is the worst possible method because they only provide slice-and-time inventory, and they do not allow for efficient container-based tracking. Not barcoding chemical inventory is another big chemical management error. Without a centralized, site-wide barcoding system, the organization will not be able to ensure accurate, real-time knowledge of all chemical containers on site. My earlier example of leaving inventory checkup to the people with no true inventory control or centralized receiving is a primary example of what not to do. Organizations with no central receiving area, either at the site level or at the department level, have no ability to account for each container as it arrives on site. Barcoding is the most efficient way to effectively maintain an active, real-time, up-to-date chemical inventory. Barcoding just speeds up the process of moving inventory, transferring ownership, and performing lab audits. And if it's easy and efficient to perform a lab audit, then you can do them more often, which in turn will give the organization a more current inventory that lab personnel can trust. In a recent case study, an organization with a large R&D center that had been using spreadsheets or an Access database for the past 15 to 20 years, through the adoption of barcoding and some new procedures, was able to reduce its overall material costs from $600,000 to $400,000 per year. That's a reduction of 33%. And one of the members of the chemical management team there said that they found that they really only need to have 2 to 3 bottles of anything on hand at one time. So it's better, fresher material. That means our experiment methods are better as well. Another common chemical management error is storing chemicals incorrectly and not accurately reporting on hazardous materials. When chemicals are stored incorrectly, well, it's unsafe for all lab personnel. Organizations that don't label chemical containers with specific instructions for storing the container run significant risk of that container being put back in the wrong place. At universities, students are at significant risk of injury when containers are not labeled properly and precautions are not taken when working with and storing that material. Organizations will also be out of compliance with the codes and standards issued by organizations such as NFPA, IBC, IFC, if they're not identifying, labeling, and storing hazardous materials properly. When organizations are not storing hazardous materials properly and they're not tracking and managing these materials, it's extremely difficult to provide accurate information to first responders. Organizations can receive significant fines or be shut down. Maximum inventory thresholds of regulated materials can easily be exceeded, and it's difficult to report accurately to regulatory agencies. Specifically, we know that fire code reports need to have total quantity reporting by class for each control area. Tier 2 reports require max and average quantities during a given period of time. The Department of Homeland Security, CFATS, requires total quantity in pounds per location. And there's also countless other local, state, and federal regulations that require unique reporting thresholds per location, per building, and per site. So if organizations are not tracking, labeling, and reporting on containers of these materials, the organization can quickly be out of compliance and may not pass a chemical management audit, can receive fines, and even be shut down. This all leads to number 8, spending more time on chemical inventory management than you need to. Spending more money on chemical inventory management than necessary just because of the lack of accurate information concerning chemical inventory affects the organization's ability to manage chemical costs effectively, leading to over-ordering and waste. We all know that right now, budget dollars are precious, and the lack of accurate information concerning chemical inventory affects the overall organization's ability to manage these chemical costs effectively. So for example, inventory support and management costs such as, well, chemical inventory storage costs, the actual processes of conducting a physical inventory, chemical inventory reporting, regulatory reporting, MSDS management, and waste stream management. These can cost organizations a lot of money and cut into budgets, limiting the organization's potential for growth. To my earlier point, organizations are continually over-ordering chemicals because they can't find them when they need them. And when the misplaced containers are found, they are often expired and can't be utilized. So the time searching for inventory, delays from missing inventory, ordering and waiting for materials to arrive on site all equal real dollars. So how can we fix these challenges? Well, in my experience, chemical management errors can be solved by optimizing people, processes, and technology. Technology can smooth out a process and make it easy for people to perform. Technology in the form of a software solution therefore must enhance the performance, handling, and monitoring of chemical management and not cause bottlenecks or usage problems. Organizations that leverage a commercial off-the-shelf chemical inventory system can increase laboratory efficiency and productivity. They can reduce resources for inventory reporting, MSDS management, and inventory management. They can reduce chemical purchases, storage, and disposal costs, maximize chemical inventory accuracy, and enhance the environmental health and safety programs and ensure regulatory compliance. Organizations must also include, along with the technology, industry best practices, which include a centralized receiving system and a limited small group for managing the chemical inventory. That's from receive all the way through to disposal. And what that does is it takes away the opportunity for highly paid research personnel actually doing the menial tasks of chemical inventory management. Streamlining receiving workflows and methods for receipts should be thoroughly examined at every organization. And a barcoding system must be put into place to identify and record all incoming materials. And that's extremely important. All incoming materials must be flagged and tracked at the container level. Also, the number of personnel performing receiving activities should be minimized. Again, to my point, if you minimize the people receiving and actually maintaining and managing the inventory is going to be more uptime or more real time because it's those people's actual job to do so. Leveraging a best-in-class chemical inventory system like SysPro helps organizations manage the chemicals that they have on site from acquisition to disposal. It also addresses regulatory compliance and allows organizations to track specifically where chemicals are and how much they have on site, generate specific reports, either site-specific reports or specific regulatory reports, and provides quick and easy access to hazard information in the event of an emergency. A best-in-class chemical inventory system should be set up in 3 separate modes. The first mode is the actual material level information. That's the identifying features, the physical properties, and the hazards and structure for that specific material. The second level should be vendor, product, and MSDS specific. That will help ensure that you have a one-to-one match of MSDS to specific product from a specific vendor. The third level is, of course, the barcoding that we talked about. Barcodes should be for owner, location. It allows for container-based tracking, so we can pay attention to expiration dates, lot numbers, and if there's a very specific need for an audit trail, that would be able to be obtained as well. Just to summarize, again, chemical management errors can be avoided by optimizing people, processes, and technology. Establishing best practices, policies and procedures, and adopting a best-in-class chemical inventory system are the keys to success. My recommendation is for a barcoding system that tracks and manages inventory at the container level, giving the organization a true picture of what was actually in inventory. At this time, I'd like to turn it back over to Tanusha, and we are going to be taking some questions from the group.
Thank you, John. A really nice talk. Good wake-up call, I must say, and very scary. I think very appropriate just in time for Halloween. For those of you who are from outside the U.S., Halloween is a holiday that we celebrate at the end of October, where kids sort of dress in costumes and go around scaring each other. But I think this, the presentation that you had was pretty scary, because you're right. I mean, I think Lab Manager did a survey not too long ago, which showed that 40% of those who surveyed still used paper copies for all their record keeping, and you alluded to that as well. So I guess it's time for a change. All right. Well, a lot of questions have come in, a lot of comments as well, and I'll try my best to go down the list and have you address as many of those as possible. I also wanted to just quickly mention that John, I don't know if you realize this, but at the beginning of your presentation, I think there was some times where your slides were a little out of sync with what you were talking. So if people want to just go back, we will have this webinar archived on our website, and the link to the archived webinar will be sent out to all of you sometime during the next few days. So if you had questions regarding specific slides, just go back and review the archive. I mean, there's lots of good information there, so you may want to review the webinar anyways. But if you have missed some slides, you can do that during the archive, with the archived version. So John, are you ready to field some questions?
Yep, I am, and my apologies to the group for the slides being out of sync.
Yeah, don't worry. I think it was just 2 or 3 slides, but I just wanted to make it clear to the attendees, because you were speaking to it, so it was fine, but they just couldn't see those slides while you were addressing some, those particular issues. But your talk came across very clearly, so that shouldn't be a problem. All right, well, here's the first question. Surfactant-based chemicals are usually the most difficult to control. Different manufacturers have different impurities, and names are usually trade names. So how do we treat small amounts versus large amounts of chemicals and surfactants? Do you have any feedback on that?
Well, it all comes down to having the visibility of the material and where it's at on site. And again, I would highly recommend large quantities and small quantities, both. You have the information about the specific material, and that's captured. So you have the identifying features of that material, the manufacturer, the vendor that it's coming from, any safety hazards or any safety specific information about that specific material, but then also tracking the small quantities of materials that you have, and if that's being aliquoted and passed from a larger container to smaller containers and being disseminated around the facility, you'll want to make sure that you absolutely track each individual container, where it's at, and when it expires.
Okay. No, that's.
I'm hoping that I did a good job with answering that specific question.
No, I think so. And you know what we are going to do is, people have your email address on the screen, so they can definitely reach out to you if they need more guidance. Some questions that have come in are very, very in-depth and need, very specific information. So we are going to forward those questions to you also, so that you can contact the person who asked the question, and you can, reach out to them one-on-one. That, I think that might be very helpful, rather than asking that question in a group. Well, the next question is there a means by which the data on the container labels can be captured, either by a program, like a barcode scanner or something like that? I think that might be very useful. Is it possible to do that?
Well, if the question's about the container labels that they receive from the specific vendors, not all vendors actually barcode their labels or their containers as they pass them out. So if the barcodes are there on the actual container, then we can take the information using a barcode scanner and take that. Typically, it has to do with the specific lot number for that specific product, but we can absolutely capture the information from that barcode. The problem being is that most vendors don't barcode the bottles when they send them out, and if they do, it's not container specific. It's mostly lot specific information.
Sure, absolutely. Well, that is a challenge. Here's a comment first, and then I would like to pose the question. So the comment is, as you know, in every lab, researchers leave their mark behind. They leave a legacy in terms of, a whole slew of unused chemicals, and then, nobody kind of looks after it after they have left. So it's a real mess, and over time it just gets escalated. So that was a comment from one of our attendees. And the question, just to piggyback on that comment, is, do all chemicals have an expiration date? Because we have in our inventory some chemicals that are decades old. There's no stamped expiration date on them. So how do you get rid of these sort of legacy chemicals?
Well, that's a great question, and I think first and foremost that is a problem, to have decades old chemical containers lying around. I think my best advice would be to reach out to the vendor that those materials actually come from, and maybe speak directly to an environmental company regarding actually how to dispose of those containers. But again, leveraging a system that provides real-time visibility for those containers on site really will stop that whole process of of not knowing the expiration date of these materials. And if it has an expiration date, you certainly want to capture that on the arrival of the containers. If there is no expiration date, then of course that wouldn't apply.
Sure. And the tracking system, does it actually track who entered or who made the update and when they made the update?
Absolutely, yes, it does. And specifically talking about the SysPro system, the system will absolutely capture and provide an audit trail for the movements of that container through the facility. It's highly recommended that a best practice chemical inventory system would do just that. And talking just a little bit to the point a little bit earlier about people that maybe just moving on and they're leaving a bunch of inventory behind, the SysPro system absolutely has the ability to take all that inventory in mass and transfer it to another lab personnel that may be taking over that area.
Correct. But just quickly following up on that, I mean, the expiration date doesn't really tell you when a chemical has degraded, right? How do you recommend people going in once in a while and actually testing the integrity of that chemical, and how do you approach that problem of degradation?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think retesting against the standard is always a best practice. However, I think the point of this conversation and this webinar is to avoid getting to that point at all, and that's to make sure that you limit the amount of materials that you have on site. That way you're using up those materials and you're having specific thresholds for those materials. You can continuously get them on order. So if you're running low, you can set a minimum threshold for that material. You can place it on order. That way you have the inventory just in time, not overstocking the inventory in supply closets just on the off chance that you will need it, because those containers will expire. And if you don't know, if you're not unsure, then again it's wasting time retesting those materials to see if they're any good. And if there's any question at all about the validity of that material, then it's going to have to be lab packed and disposed of.
Sure, absolutely. And then how do you know, using this tracking system, how do you know when a chemical is used up or whether it has been disposed of? Somebody has to physically go in there and enter that information, correct?
Can you repeat that question, Tanusha?
Sure. How do you know when a chemical is used up or it has been disposed of?
Well, through container-based tracking, our best practice workflow is leveraging that barcode label that's actually on the bottle. And what we use is, and we highly recommend, piggyback labels. That way, when the contents of the container are actually used up, all the end user, researcher has to do is peel the top layer of that label off, put it on what we call a disposal log, and then somebody that's responsible for keeping the inventory up to date just comes along with their scanner, scans the word for dispose, scans all those labels, and then they're all disposed of electronically, keeping the inventory completely up to date.
I see. So you do. That's a really nice recommendation, but that also implies that you have a dedicated person who is in charge of chemical management in your lab.
Sure. And if there's not a dedicated person, which, by the way, is our best practice recommendation of having dedicated personnel for managing chemical inventory. But if you don't, then it's just as simple as using a keyboard wedge scanner, logging into the actual system, and disposing those containers. And most people, researchers, if they wait to the end of their day and they have a small collection of containers that are already used up, they'll wait to the end of the day and they'll go and they'll actually scan all of those materials out. But the key is to having a simple system and leveraging that barcode technology. It just turns into a few simple scans in order for them to comply. And that way, again, the biggest issue is real-time visibility. If I'm a researcher and I want to log into my system to see what's in active inventory, I want to make sure that that inventory is as real-time as possible. So we want to make it simple and easy for the end users to comply with and to adopt.
Sure. Well, the next question is, how do you barcode very small containers? Maybe vials that are less than 1 milliliters or even smaller than that. How do you barcode something like that?
Sure, that's a fantastic question. And it's my experience, and I've been on site actually at a few organizations that are tracking very, very small vials, and they just simply leverage a plastic baggie. And so they'll put all the contents of or maybe just a small vial inside the plastic baggie and put a barcode label on the outside of that baggie. It seems to work really, really well.
Yeah, that's a good and straightforward solution. All right. Any recommendations for software that can also integrate a QC test for all incoming materials?
Well, there's some specifics around that, and that's probably a good question for an offline. If whoever asked that question can contact me directly. But having a best-in-class web-based solution would easily be able to integrate with other solutions, other software solutions out there. But typically, that's more work as far as discovery to understand the specifics of what needs to be done, what the touch points are of the integration.
Okay, got it. And we'll be happy to forward that question along to you. All right. Here's one. What are some of the disadvantages of using barcodes?
Well, the disadvantages of using barcodes are if you have a very small inventory of just basically maybe operational, maintenance materials that you only have a few of that are hanging around. Maybe it's just a maintenance shop or something that you have some degreasers and some other materials around. That probably would not constitute having an actual barcoding system. So where SysPro and a best-in-class chemical inventory system really shines is in the laboratory setting when there's lots and lots of containers of lots and lots of materials. So again, if it's a small organization with very few materials hanging around, that probably wouldn't be the best possible fit. However, it's still very important to understand the specific details of that specific material, and having a material safety data sheet is absolutely required. But when it comes to actual container management of those materials at smaller facilities, not always absolutely necessary.
Sure. Okay, what are your recommendations when you have a large open space lab that is shared by multiple PIs who order and receive chemicals individually? How do you track chemicals in that scenario?
It boils down to what I was saying, the people, policies, and procedures. And sometimes it's painful, but it's going to be an organizational change. Capturing those materials as they arrive, one dedicated person or maybe a couple of dedicated people that are receiving those bottles as they're arriving, the researchers can still place them on order, but when they're received by that personnel, they're actually put into the individual's inventory. That way the researcher doesn't have to worry about doing that work, and it can be easily identified as their own personal inventory. But again, capturing that inventory as it arrives and not allowing that inventory to be put on somebody's desk or ordered and received without any type of check-in process. Again, that's a people, policies, and procedures methodology that definitely needs to change if you want to gain control over your inventory at your site.
Sure. If a container does not have an expiration date, what would you recommend as being the next step?
Can you repeat that question? I'm not sure if I fully understand the content.
So if a container, a chemical container, did not have an expiration date, what would you suggest as a next step? I guess then you have to keep testing it over time, right, to make sure that it's still in.
Yeah, I think it boils down to if you don't trust the content of that container, then you should make sure that you get in touch with the waste management team or the EH&S professional there at your organization to ask what the next steps should be.
Sure. Okay. How do you dispose of very small quantities of chemicals?
Well, again, if you're tracking the very small quantities of chemicals at the container level, then you're leveraging the system for the barcoding system for easily getting rid of all those containers out of the system electronically. And back to my original point of the barcode scanning, easily scanning the word for dispose and then scanning all those containers as being disposed. So large quantities, small quantities, everything in between, we're tracking material-specific and then container-specific information. And to your point about very small quantities, that's container-specific information. And so if it's just a small quantity within that container, when it's gone, you'll follow the same process to dispose that specific container.
Okay. Well, here's a question that I'm sure a lot of people are facing. How do you track inventory when you have handled chemicals so far using an in-house system?
Sure. Well, in-house systems can work if the in-house system has barcoding technology built into it. One of the drawbacks that we've seen, and that I see quite often actually for in-house systems, is they're often designed by people long time ago, and since that's not their primary, maybe it was designed by an IT person that was working at the facility, or maybe it was designed by somebody that fancied themselves as sort of a programmer. Typically, those aren't updated very regularly, and they don't keep up to date with technology and with modern systems. And sometimes those professionals, those people move on from the organization, and then the organization's just stuck with an old system that's out of date and that doesn't have any updates planned, and is going to be quickly out of compliance when it comes to migrating to any of the new operating systems that are being released on the machines that you're working with. So our best practice recommendation is leveraging a commercial off-the-shelf system that will continuously be in active development.
Okay. This person has the large stock bottles, and then they have, I guess, smaller student dropper bottles. I've seen this placed in the hood. So do you recommend actually barcoding both, or how do you handle chemicals that are, pulled aside from the main container?
Yeah, I definitely do. And so if there's a large container, then you're pouring small quantities of that same material into smaller child containers. Absolutely, tracking the child containers is key, because the child containers will move around the facility as well, and they become a life of their own. So absolutely, tracking both the parent and child containers is extremely important.
Okay. Here's another question. We have found many suppliers of foods, raw materials, who do not supply a MSDS. Rather, they supply a letter saying that they are not required to provide a MSDS. So in that scenario, what's the best way to capture the NFPA hazard information?
Well, I think doing more research on that specific material is going to be absolutely necessary. And keep in mind, as I was describing within the actual presentation, the way that a best-in-class system should be set up is to have the material level information captured, which is all the informatics about that specific material. And once you build that one time, anytime you receive more containers of that specific material, you're always going to have that high-level information persist. So finding and discovering what the NFPA values would be for that specific material, doing your research, maybe it's locating someone who knows more about that vendor or that specific product. Once you capture that information and flag it as being a certain property, it'll always continue, and you never have to worry about doing that again for that specific material. But it's just going to take more research and time on your part to understand the specific NFPA information about that material if the vendor's not providing it.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Do you have any suggestions for gathering the container location data? Do you recommend RFID or manual entry into a workstation?
Well, when it comes to chemical inventory management, RFID is proven to really not to be very effective. And Chemist W, we've done a lot of research on RFID technology. So when it comes to building out your actual locations and location within the actual system itself, we absolutely can barcode those locations, and we highly recommend keeping the locations pretty simple. And so within a laboratory, you can drill down to maybe the lab level, a storage, maybe a cabinet, a shelf, a specific bin. But our best practice workflow recommendation is keeping it at the lab level and maybe one layer beneath the lab level. That way, it's easier for the end users to adopt, because they don't want to have to log into the system and say that they're moving one container from one shelf to the next. So if it's at the lab level, that's always best. And again, absolutely recommend barcoding those locations and not leveraging RFID.
Okay. And how long should these records actually be maintained for, at least the chemicals that have been already disposed of? How long do the records have to exist?
I'm not quite sure how long the records need to exist. If we're talking the material safety data sheets and the information thereof, I believe it's 30 years that the record has to persist, that the actual material was on site at a given time.
Okay. Okay. And in your opinion, I mean, this updating of chemicals, do you think it should be done daily, weekly, monthly? Yeah, I guess it also depends on the number of chemicals you have in your facility, but have you, in your experience, worked out a good time scale?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It really boils down to the organization and just the amount of containers that you have on site and what your reporting needs are. Of course, again, if it's simple and easy to maintain the inventory, then the inventory is going to be kept up to date very regularly. And so doing an inventory audit should be done, if you can do it monthly or quarterly, that would be highly recommended. That way you have the accurate visibility on exactly what's out there in inventory. Smaller organizations, smaller labs can do it maybe weekly. Just go in and do a quick scan of your inventory, making sure that it's up to date.
Yeah, I agree totally. John, there are so many questions regarding what to do when the MSDSs are not available. Like we have somebody from Nigeria saying we have all these chemicals that come to our lab which are often repackaged and sold without MSDSs. So what should I do? There's a person who's asking about new chemicals or new molecules that have no associated MSDS documentation. So I think a lot of people are facing this challenge where there is not a relevant MSDS that comes along with the product. So what is your sort of general recommendation in all these cases?
Well, my recommendation would be that if at the material level, whatever the specific material is, regardless of the vendor, just to have some information, some hazard information about that specific material, maybe looking up that material from another supplier or another vendor, something that would be very similar. And I know that there's some obscure small molecules out there that are only available through certain vendors, and in that case, I wouldn't have a recommendation. I'm not sure exactly how you would obtain that information if there's no information to be found. But just as a general practice, having a generalized MSDS as sort of a last resort can be an answer to that question. Okay.
Well, John, there are a lot more questions that have come in, and are you okay to go on?
I think, yeah, we have another, I think, is it 5 minutes, Tanusha? Is that what we have?
Yeah, I think we can go a little over, because the beauty of a webinar like this is, people have access to you and to your expertise and guidance in real time. So I would like to, have an opportunity to address all the questions that have come in, and we'll definitely forward you ones that are very specific in nature, or the ones which are very specific to the CISPRO product. We'll definitely forward those along to you. But I think if you don't mind, we can keep going for a few minutes past the webinar time, if that's okay with you.
That's fine with me. Appreciate the response.
Yeah, it's been overwhelming, and thank you all for your time and attention and for all these questions, because I think that really is our goal, is to keep things very interactive and to help you get the answers that you're looking for. And a quick reminder, and also this will give John, I guess, time to take a quick sip of water if you need it. The webinar will be archived on Lab Manager's website, www.labmanager.com, and the link to the archive will be sent to you, over the next few days. So if you have, if you have any questions after this event is over, you can definitely reach out to John. His email is provided on your screen. So let's move to the next one. Next question. Where can I find, before I go to the next question, I should also remind people that the slides will not be available for downloading off of our website. So you'll have to contact John directly about that. So the next question, John, is where can I find information about the maximum inventory threshold of regulated materials?
Absolutely, great question. And there's a lot of content on the web, and if it's a very specific material and you're wondering who do I have to report this material to and how much I have and what the threshold quantities are, a lot of that content can be found directly. If you're in the U.S., you can go to a lot of the government sites that are out there that will give you very specific information. So the web is an extremely powerful tool when it comes to understanding and knowing specific regulations. And within the tool, within the chemical inventory system itself, there's an ability to pull down and attach the list of CAS values that are listed underneath a certain under certain, like the Department of Homeland Security. They'll have a listing of CAS values of materials that are reportable to Department of Homeland Security. So just as an example, so all those lists are out there, and again, the Internet's a very powerful tool for finding all of that information.
Okay. Well, your earlier comment about barcoding child containers has sparked off a series of comments. I think you should address that, because people are saying, oh, it's that doubles the work and it doubles the time it takes to maintain your inventory, etc. So is there an easier way to create the child container label from the parent container information? And any other advice on dealing with those child containers? Because I think we're not talking about a child. I think they are, there are usually children who are involved here. There are lots and lots of these bottles floating around in the lab.
Sure. Well, and let me address that in a couple of different ways. So with my best practice is always to less is more. So if you only have to report on the specific quantities of materials that you have on site from the time that it's arrived to the time that it's disposed, so we call that, we just call that, it's tracking by the actual bottle, so container-based tracking. So if it's a 4-liter container, when it arrives on site, we're just tracking that container as a 4-liter container until it's disposed, because it's always best to over-report than under-report. So along with that, some organizations need to track very specific amounts of materials used. If the material is highly regulated or very expensive, they need to do what we call unit of measure tracking. So they'll be able to take small amounts of that material and record that they've used up a small amount of that specific material. But if you don't have to do that, then yeah, it does require more work. So if you don't need to do that work, then it's not necessary to keep the inventory up to date. Same applies for tracking the child containers. If there's no real reason for you to track that, if you're not being regulated in any way, or if you don't need to track those child containers and track the specific lot that those child containers came from, then there's no necessity for doing that. It's going to be very much organizational specific needs for tracking and managing the inventory. And the beauty about the tool that we're talking about today is it's fully configurable to meet the standards and the capabilities of organizations that just say, hey, we just want to track this, that it's here, how much was on site, and how much we disposed, all the way to organizations that say, I need to track very specifically every ounce of this material that we used, and I need to track have a detailed audit trail for every step of the way that this container had to go through. So it's really organizational specific. It is more work, but if your facility requires it, then it's actually made a lot easier leveraging that technology that we talked about.
Okay, and just to follow up on that comment that you just made, here's a question: do you recommend then barcoding all chemicals that are brought into the lab? Some of them may be off-the-shelf chemicals or fertilizers that may have been purchased from like a chemical company, or it could be items that have been just bought in a grocery store, like acetone, say. So do you recommend then tracking every single item in the lab?
That's a fantastic question, and really the answer is if you want to understand the specific quantities, if you need to understand the specific quantities of that material, then you need to barcode it. If there's no need to understand the specific quantities, then maybe having a placeholder for those high volume materials that come and go regularly, like acetone, we burn through a lot of acetone, then you have a regular placeholder that says at any given time on site we have X amount of acetone available and for usage. So that way you're not actually having to individually barcode those specific containers.
Okay, yeah, that seems a little simpler to implement.
Yeah, and the same really goes for laboratory supplies as well, and that's the same basic concept. You don't want to have to individually barcode every pipette tip that's arrived on site or gloves. So we have placeholders for saying that we have X amount of medium nitrile gloves hanging around the facility.
Okay, okay. And then your system, in the tracking system, you can also actually determine when a chemical is running low, correct?
Absolutely. That's definitely a default feature, and should be a default feature of any best-in-class chemical inventory system, the ability to set certain threshold limits for materials, especially when it comes to those highly used materials. And if you're using it and you say, maybe it's something that it takes you 6 months to reorder and have it arrive, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those minimum thresholds.
Okay. And then, since we've talked about MSDSs so much, do you have any, and you recommended that people go out and do their own research if there is something that doesn't have one associated with it. So do you have now any sort of guidance in terms of how you go about developing your own MSDS system using either the tracking software or something else?
Boy, Tanusha, that's a hard question to answer. I really don't have any recommendations when it comes to building your own MSDS system. My best practice recommendation is to leverage a best-in-class MSDS provider that obtains and manages those MSDS regularly for the organization. So it's always best to have that work be done by the professionals.
Okay, all right. Well, but I guess MSDS is high on people's list as far as questions go.
Absolutely.
Here's a question that I don't quite know if this is related to the tracking system, but do you have any sense of what effect it would have if you're using an industrial grade chemical versus a laboratory grade chemical? And I'm assuming this relates to tracking, but it may not.
So maybe I'm kind of taking a wild stab at where this question is stemming from. It could be bulk, high volume bulk materials that are arriving on site, and then you have to just ask the question of if this is necessary to report. One of the things that we see is if it's maybe a manufacturing site where there's a small number of actual materials, but those materials are in very, very high volume. And the containers of those materials aren't really in specific laboratories, but they're more in large storage facilities. That would not necessitate doing any type of barcoding at all.
Okay. Well, John, your comments are sparking more comments, and I think it's time to, call it a day and bring the webinar to an end. But thank you all so much for, keeping this so interactive and for sending in your questions and comments. I realize this is probably a topic that is, that's very important and it's very relevant to all of you. So I appreciate you taking the time, joining us, and participating in the webinar. John, thank you so much for, patiently hearing all the questions and taking your time to answer them. I'm sure you might get a few more questions via email, and definitely, some people will be reaching out to you for a copy of your slides. So if you don't mind, taking the time to get back to them, I would appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much, Tanusha, and for everybody who's still on the line, thank you very much for taking time to attend today's webinar, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Sure, thank you. And again, on behalf of Lab Manager, I would like to thank not only John, but also our sponsor, ChemSW, for supporting this event. I want to reiterate that the webinar will be archived on Lab Manager's website. So if you have missed the early part of the presentation, or if you want to go back and review some of the material that John presented, you can definitely do so, and it will be on there for a few months at least. You can also get more information on ChemSW's website, which is www.chemsw.com. So once again, thank you all for your time and attention. Please join us if you can this Thursday, a couple of days from now, where I will be discussing with a few experts some of the innovations that have been taking place in liquid and gas chromatography, and also talking about some of the new applications in that space. So until then, goodbye and good luck.